Good Thursday afternoon, everybody. Rob O'Connor here from RobVenoSports.com with college early look for Week 4 of the 2017 season. We'll take a look back at everything we saw in Week 3 and some of the ramifications from what happened in Week 3. Then we will look ahead to some of the big matchups that are on tap for this weekend. To do all of that, we need to bring in the founder of RobVenoSports.com, none other than Rob Veno himself. Rob, how are you this evening?
I'm doing good, Rob. How about you?
Doing well. It's been a crazy start to the college football season, and I think you could sum up the craziness in one play from last week, the Hail Mary that Tennessee gave up, allowed Florida to win what was a terrible game through 3 quarters, but allowed Florida to win 26-20. We'll talk about the impact of that on Tennessee. And more importantly, my question for you, is there any other way Tennessee hasn't lost to Florida yet other than maybe a 109-yard punt return for a touchdown? They find a new way to lose every year.
Yeah, that was a heartbreaker once again for Tennessee. As you mentioned, that game didn't even get started until the fourth quarter, and then we had a lot of back and forth, and Tennessee held the lead one more time and could not hang on. A lot of blame tossed around, Rob, after the game and throughout this week so far. We sit here, almost early evening on the East Coast on Wednesday, and Butch Jones obviously criticized for the defense that was played there, but I just don't know if you're Tennessee, how much worse it could get against Florida. They did get the huge comeback against Georgia Tech to start the season. Imagine if they had lost that game and then this game as well. Those would have been 2 tough ones where they come from behind and would have wound up losing. So thank goodness they won the Georgia Tech game, but they'll have to focus on the rest of the SEC season now. And, those people that were calling for Butch Jones' head to begin the season, certainly their voices are even louder right now.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a really tough one. I think that, again, Tennessee was the better team. A lot of questionable play calling, especially down inside the red zone. I mean, you have the ball inside the 2-yard line, and you're passing, and you have probably one of the best playmakers in the entire country at running back. So there's a lot to be desired there from the Tennessee fans in terms of the play calling. For Florida, on the other side, huge win. They avoid that 0-2 start. Still a lot of questions surrounding some of their top playmakers with the suspensions for alleged credit card fraud. Not sure they're going to play this week, and not sure when those suspensions may end and when they'll get back in, but nice for them to get off to a 1-0 start in SEC play. Another great game that went well into the night. Texas give USC all they can handle, lose 27-24 in double overtime. Texas defense looked like a totally different team from the team that played Maryland in Week 1. What do you think, even in the loss, what do you think this does for Texas as they get ready to go into Big 12 play, and they're going to have to play the likes of TCU, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State? Does this kind of put Texas back into the mix as a possible either spoiler or team to win the Big 12?
Yeah, well, I think it does, Rob. If you combine it with the 56-0 win over San Jose State the week before, I think it makes those who were all over Tom Herman after the opening week loss to Maryland, where Tom Herman didn't exactly take it graciously either. He kind of blamed a lot of things. Tom Herman inherited a lot of talent there at Texas, and they came up real shy against Maryland. But the bounce back against San Jose was a demolition. The game against USC, obviously, they were a huge underdog, 17-point underdog, only lose by 3, takes USC double overtime to beat them. So I think that game one now gets sort of blown off to the side as a mirage, and people now, that were critical of Tom Herman and Texas in week one are now standing in a little different spot right now. For us to handicap these games, I mean, it's a simple numbers adjustment and move on. Some of the contests last week, it's hard to tell, Rob, if there was a carryover on the USC side from the huge game against Stanford the week before. They're playing Stanford in what was billed as a potential down the road Pac-12 championship game while Texas is playing San Jose State. So, Tennessee, USC could have come in a little overconfident. There's no doubt about that. Their defense held up very good also. But, again, a great ending to a football game because Texas, to their credit, goes on a 91-yard touchdown drive to go up 17-14 with 45 seconds left, and then USC comes back with the 31-yard field goal as time expires to get them into overtime. Real good game. I think USC got a little bit more than they expected, and I think what we saw out of that is all those recruiting rankings that have been attached to Texas over the past couple of years, and people were wondering where is this talent when it comes to the field. I think we're starting to see it on the field, but let's face it, it's a brand-new coaching staff, both sides of the ball, and it takes a little bit of time to get things going. So maybe Tom Herman's pointed in the right direction now with the Longhorns.
Could be, and they're going to have a chance to prove themselves. They get to play everybody in the Big 12, so pull a few upsets, maybe win the Red River rivalry game, beat Oklahoma State, beat TCU, grab a win in one of those two games, and next thing you know, that Maryland loss will be a distant memory to a lot of Texas fans. Let's talk about what was billed as the game of the weekend. It actually didn't even end up being the best game of Saturday night. The Texas-USC game was most certainly better than the Clemson-Louisville game. Now, going in, you would have told me Clemson's going to win by 10, maybe even 17 points. I could see that happening. It wouldn't have shocked me, but for the complete domination that they had both offensively and defensively, I think Clemson is really setting up well to make a lot of noise and a deep run into the college football playoffs. Again, what do you think after what you saw Saturday night?
Yeah, I don't know that from my perspective it was all that unexpected. Perhaps the margin of victory a little more than I thought, but I just didn't feel the matchup was good for Louisville in that game, Robert. If you take into account what Louisville had done in the two games previous and into account what Clemson had done the two games previous, a lot of national hype all of a sudden reemerged around Lamar Jackson and Heisman Trophy talk. But, to face that defensive line of Clemson, and we saw what they did to Auburn, and granted the Auburn offense is not the same as Louisville's, but Clemson up front is able to contain a mobile quarterback, and they put a lot of pressure on that night. It was very difficult for Louisville to get anything going. I would say more than half of their points, without having it right in front of me, were scored late in that game. And then on the other side of the football, when they looked at Louisville's defense after facing Auburn the week before, they had to think, wow, this is fairly easy. They had a great game out of Kelly Bryant, a rookie quarterback, only in his third game. Louisville is not a good defensive team by any measure. They've shown that so far this year. And I just think that they were a little overrated coming into that game. Clemson took it to them. I'll say one thing about the Clemson Tigers, and especially about their head coach, Dabo Swinney, is you're learning now not to expect letdowns from week to week out of the Clemson Tigers. A lot of the handicap or some of the incorporation into the handicap from a lot of guys in the business last week was, well, they played a real difficult game against Auburn the week before. They were up for that. Probably can't get up twice in a row. It didn't make a difference for Clemson. I think also what was attached to that game was a lot of sentiment that Lamar Jackson ran up big numbers the year before, he can do it again. But I countered that a little bit last week. When they played Louisville last year, when Lamar Jackson was just becoming a household name, it was in week 5 of the season, and I just don't know that Clemson understood how good Lamar Jackson was at that point. We learned afterwards how good he was, but they probably took him lightly a little bit last year, certainly not lightly this year. I'm with you. Clemson sets up as one of those teams that is now, if we can say the word favored, to get one of the 4 slots at the end of the season. It's awfully early to be picking favorites, but if we're putting 4 teams on top, Clemson would be one of them at this point in time. Defense is unbelievably good, and the more experienced Bryant gets at quarterback, the better they're going to be because they've got all the other pieces.
Absolutely. I think that they clearly have a manageable schedule ahead of them. I mean, the other big team that they were going to have to try and get past within their own division was Florida State, and I really think that Florida State's kind of just taken themselves out of the equation with the injury to Francois. They've only played 1 game this year. They're finally going to get back on the field this coming weekend. But again, freshman quarterback, too many good teams that they're going to have to play. Florida State still got to play Miami. They still got to play Louisville. They still got to play Clemson. I just don't see how Florida State's going to be able to overcome all of that and compete with Louisville or Clemson. And now Clemson, even if they were to slip up somewhere, say they have a bad game at some point like they did against Pitt last year and kind of inexplicably lose, they have the tiebreaker with Louisville. So I think that's going to end up being a really big advantage to them at the end of the year. And barring something really unforeseen, I think they have a clear path to the ACC title game at this point.
Yeah, it's on paper. It sets up real well for them. We'll see how it plays out. We'll also get to see how James Blackman is at quarterback for FSU against a pretty tough North Carolina State defense, so that's not going to be any picnic. Be interested to see what kind of numbers he puts up in that game on Saturday afternoon.
Rob, let's pretend that there's hardly any time left on the clock and we're up 56-0. We're going to take a quick break and remind all of our listeners that you can go to robvenosports.com and get all the information you need. Rob's power rankings, injury updates, statistical analysis, really phenomenal stuff. robvenosports.com, plus plays from myself, Rob, Derek. It's all there, robvenosports.com. Rob, you have to like how I worked in a plug for our site and took a shot at Penn State at the same time.
Yeah, although James Franklin would take offense at it. His explanation has been heard over and over again this week, and I'm not sure that, I don't side with him in that instance. James Franklin is a no-nonsense type head coach, and the special teams unit was messed up, and he doesn't like to give any play away, whether it's 56-0 or 3-0. He's not going to let his team off the hook with some sloppy setup or not knowing your assignments or who should be on the field. So he claims that's why he took the time out, and he also said, hey, we were going to try and block the field goal. 56-0 or not, we're still going to try and block the field goal. So I give him credit for being a head coach that teaches his personnel not to take a single play off during the game, no matter what the score is, treat it as 0-0. The play caller from the sidelines, as far as offense is concerned, can handle not running up a score on a team. But as far as an attempted field goal, I know people took it negatively when it first happened, as if he was trying to ice a kicker. But according to Franklin, that's not the case at all. It's just we have to run every single play as sharp as we can possibly run it, and we weren't sharp on that play, so I had to call a timeout.
Well, there were quite a few top 25 teams to go down, and we'll get to 3 of those in a second, and I have a question for you on them. But we'll start with what I'm guessing you're going to be in agreement with me on. LSU was not only the biggest upset of the weekend, it was the most lopsided and embarrassing upset of the weekend. I mean, just an absolutely terrible start to SEC play for them. I mean, Mississippi State controlled that game start to finish.
And I think you never know to start a season, right, Rob? There had been some rumblings out of Starkville. Dan Mullen was quietly confident. They came out their first 2 games. They played really well, but still, it's Mississippi State. Generally speaking, they're anywhere from third to the bottom in that SEC West. Third would be a high point for them. But I think on that day, on last Saturday evening, they let everybody know that that team is for real. LSU very rarely in recent memory gets manhandled the way they got manhandled in that game. The key to that entire offense for Mississippi State is to try somehow and contain Nick Fitzgerald, and LSU couldn't do it. LSU was extremely depth-shy by the end of that game across the defensive line. I think they finished that game with only 4 healthy bodies on the defensive front. They had a couple of targeting ejections. They also had an injury to their starting nose tackle in that game. So they were down numbers as the game went on, but boy, oh boy, Mississippi State put themselves on the map. It didn't show up in the point spread to start the week as Georgia opened a 6.5-point favorite over Mississippi State. It was a little bit eye-opening to me. It's been since bet down to 4 as we speak right now. So bettors certainly siding with Dan Mullen's team at this point in time. And as long as they can, this is the next step in the maturation for this particular group. We don't want to put the previous group, Dak Prescott's group, in here, but this team from last year to this year, their next step is to show that they can come off of a decisive upset victory, a very, in their case, thrilling victory, and play the next week. SEC competition is a gauntlet. You have to be ready every Saturday, and we're going to find out if Dan Mullen can get his troops to give the 100% effort and the same focus that they gave last week against LSU.
I mean, where does LSU go from here? I mean, they've got a couple of weeks to recover. They play Syracuse and Troy next before they get Florida at Auburn. So, I mean, they got a little bit of time here. But I don't see it. I see a team that got run over, gave up 146 yards to Williams. I see a team that could not get a stop when they needed a stop. And I saw an offense that did not look impressive against a team that actually has a SEC stout type of defense.
Yeah, and we're going to see now because Matt Canada obviously didn't forget how to coach offense. He's got a terrific playbook, and he's widely regarded as one of the best offensive minds in college football today. However, in my case, Rob, I had made the correlation that Danny Etling is comparable to Nate Peterman, who quarterbacked the Pitt team last year, which really preseason, heading into last September, you didn't think Pitt was going to be an offensive juggernaut. Matt Canada comes in there and turns them into an offensive juggernaut behind Peterman. Maybe the mistake on my end was thinking that Peterman and Etling were comparable. Perhaps Peterman's 2-3 levels above Danny Etling here. Now, I know there was a lot of frustration with just some of the basic play calling, like too many runs. This looks like typical LSU. I don't know how much that has to do with the quarterback situation, but what I think I can take away from that is Danny Etling is just never going to lead this team the way that, you would expect LSU to be led with a dynamic offensive coordinator. I think they can come back from it, though. Like I say, they were shy numbers on the defensive side. They'll have a week to get healthy. In the second half of this game against Syracuse, they'll get the 2 ejected players back. Darius Geis will sit out this week because he's hurt. I don't know that it'll matter against Syracuse. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But he'll have a week to get healthy. And then they'll get back to SEC play. There's no better motivation than an absolute embarrassment for a team like LSU to get back on the right track. I know one thing, the calls for Ed Orgeron's head were immediate. That's the way SEC fan bases are, boy. You don't produce. It's much like we were just talking about with Texas and Tom Herman a couple of games ago. We'll see how it goes from here. I'd be interested to see while they travel up to Syracuse, non-conference game, how that one ends up. But I think LSU still, you can't write them off at this point in time. But it certainly was an awakening to the rest of the college football world that Mississippi State is a team to be reckoned with.
Three teams at the bottom end of the top 25 lost on Saturday. So a few questions about that. First, of Kansas State, Stanford, UCLA, which one of those surprises you the most?
Well, it would have to be Stanford. Maybe you don't expect them to cover the spread. They were laying 8.5, 9 points, but you don't expect them to lose. And they lost in a decisive manner. And you go through the statistics of that game, Rob, and they were outplayed by San Diego State. Two teams under their respective head coaches that play the exact same style. Let's pound the football. Let's play solid defense. Two different conferences, obviously, but same philosophy on the football field on both sides of the ball. And San Diego State was the team that came out and, again, like we were just saying about Mississippi State and LSU, they pretty much manhandled Stanford. All that being said, Stanford had themselves a lead until the game-winning touchdown with 54 seconds left in that contest. SDSU scores, goes ahead, and then holds off Stanford at the end and wins that game. If not for a couple of Bryce Love 50-yard touchdown runs, how about these numbers? Stanford only had 42 plays in the entire game, and the other 40 outside of those two Bryce Love touchdown runs, which were explosive plays, those 40 plays only gained 134 yards. San Diego State was absolutely the more physical team. They out-Stanford, so to speak, and we'll see where Stanford goes from here. Big game against UCLA this week because now the Cardinals, off of two losses, really picked apart by USC the week before, then out-physicaled by San Diego State. It's a big game for David Shaw in that program this week.
San Diego State, are they now in the mix as one of the front runners for that guaranteed bowl bid for the group of 5 schools?
Yeah, when you look around the Mountain West and what their possibility, what their chances are of going undefeated, of running the table, the Mountain West generally would present Boise as a threat. Boise is a little bit down inside their division because they're in the weaker division for sure. San Diego State doesn't play in the division with Colorado State. I don't see who their crossover games are this year. I don't have that in front of me. But the bottom line is they're the best team in the conference. I think there's a couple of teams that have a shot at them. Wyoming played them very tough last year, and even though they've got off to a sluggish start, if Wyoming is on that schedule once again, I would think that they and Colorado State are the only two. Otherwise, they
don't play, and they don't have to play Colorado State or Wyoming this year. So the earliest they'd see either of those teams is a title game,
which really puts them in a catbird seat, so to speak, Rob, because their division is, like I said earlier, the weaker of the two. They probably, if they're avoiding Colorado State and Wyoming, then I'm going to assume out of the Mountain Division they're going to catch Boise State.
They do, but it's a home game.
Home game for them, and Boise State right now is figuring some things out, playing with a two-headed quarterback because Brett Rippon had got a concussion a couple of weeks ago. So a lot of things will be answered over the next few weeks, but once again, on paper, they look like a team that has a path and a very legitimate path to an undefeated record and to be that team from the lesser group of 5. I think Houston sits in that conversation as well. Right now, 2-0. They'll have a game against Texas Tech this week if they can defeat Texas Tech. Houston, playing in the west side of the American Athletic Conference, will have a tougher schedule than San Diego State. But Houston, under Major Applewhite in his first year, look like a team that's also capable of running the table. They'll have, like I say, they'll have tougher games, and they'll have to rise up to more challenges than San Diego State will. But Houston has that level of talent, and it's interesting that those two teams played each other in a bowl game last year, and SDSU really whacked Houston as Tom Herman was on the way out. So look at those two teams, and then maybe something else will develop over the course of the season.
Let's jump ahead to some big news out of Nebraska. AD out after a embarrassing loss to Northern Illinois 21-17. They throw 2 pick sixes in the game was really what the difference was, and the offense could not get on track to overcome it. And then after the game, he kind of threw Coach Riley under the bus, gave him like an endorsement that wasn't an endorsement, or however you want to put it, but just not a good situation in Nebraska, as they're now 1-2 to start the season.
Yeah, it's interesting that, the AD was the guy to go. Probably shows that they have a little more faith in Mike Riley. They paid him a lot of money to do the right thing there in Nebraska to win games, and he hasn't done that so far. But that game was, for all intent and purposes, well, Nebraska did make a second-half comeback and took the lead, but then they gave it away. But like you said, in the first quarter, those 2 pick sixes happened. Nebraska took the opening kickoff, went all the way to the Northern Illinois 9-yard line, and then threw a wide receiver screen that got picked and run back 91 yards. So it went from what looked like was going to be a 7-0 Nebraska lead to a 7-0 Northern Illinois lead. Then they threw one more, 14-0. They were down, and they never really recovered. They were out there without their top running back in that game. Tanner Lee, the quarterback, the transfer from Tulane, who in Big Ten circles had a lot of hype coming into the game. He's a drop-back passer, got a strong arm, but he hasn't really got the cohesiveness with his wide receiving core yet. They've had some major drops that have hurt the quarterback, but Nebraska's a team that really hasn't come together yet. They were life and death with Arkansas State in week 1, right? Arkansas State on a 4th and goal overshot a receiver in the end zone that would have tied the game and sent it to overtime. So there's plenty of problems, most notably on the defensive end, I would say, for Nebraska right now. I think they're a little better offensively than they are defensively, but this is a team that was expected to challenge in the Big Ten West this year, and right now they don't look like much of a challenger. Mike Riley's going to have to get something done here immediately. I think it's going to be hard, though, Rob, because that defense was turned over to Bob Diaco, the Connecticut coach the last couple of years, who got fired, and they've installed a new system that the team just doesn't seem to, it hasn't taken to very well. So we'll see where Nebraska goes from here. They have a big game this week. Every game will be a big game for Nebraska from here on out. But I think Mike Riley feels the heat right now. He's a pretty calm guy, but I think internally he feels the heat.
So we've seen 3 weeks, or in some cases 3 weeks plus the game in opening weekend, or whatever you want to call it. I'm sure you've been making some adjustments to your power rankings. I know you don't make dramatic adjustments, but now you've had a chance to see 3 games out of most of these teams. Who are some of your biggest movers up and down after 3 weeks?
Well, I mean, the top 2 that sit in a tie right now have been moved in a positive fashion up the ladder by 8.5 points over the course of the first 3 weeks. Wouldn't be big news to casual college football folks, but Buffalo and Marshall out of the MAC and Conference USA have been the biggest jumps so far this year. They've done real damage to the point spread. Mississippi State is right behind them. They've been moved up 8 points in my rankings. Then we get a 3-way tie, 3 teams that have been pushed up 7 points. New Mexico State out of the Sun Belt, Oregon out of the Pac-12, who seems to be back on track under Willie Taggart, and Purdue, who under Jeff Brom in 3 games has really raised some eyebrows. So those are 6 of the major moves so far. Like I say, you get a lot of teams that are from lesser conferences, but, hey, we can bet on them all, so we have to keep numbers on them all.
Well, Robin, you make a great point that, a lot of people that are just casual fans of college football are looking at the SEC game of the week, Notre Dame, USC, and whatever game ABC puts on Saturday night. And they forget that there's a lot of football teams that might not necessarily be good or sexy names, but there are point spreads on all of those games, and there is money to be made, whether it's on a point spread or a total. So you can't just get caught up in these big-name programs and these big-name games. In those games, a lot of times the lines tend to be a little more tighter and a little more on point. The odds makers spend a little more time looking at them because they know that the games are going to take some heavy action from not only the professional bettors but from the public as well. You get down to some of these lesser-known games like Ohio versus Buffalo or a Bowling Green versus Western Kentucky, and you get a game where they might not quite spend as much time on the number and really looking over everything. They throw something out there that they think will work, and they're not going to take a lot of public money on it, and if they notice a lot of sharp money one way or the other, they tend to adjust the line pretty quickly, but without a lot of public interest in this game, sometimes they get overlooked.
Yeah, they certainly do, Rob, and it's important for people to know that power ratings are adjusted mathematically, basically derived on the margin between what the closing line was and what the final score was. If you're favored by 7 and you win by 1, your power rating might get, downgraded a shade. If you're a 17-point underdog and you lose by 6, your power rating gets upgraded. Even though it's a loss, you move up in the power ratings because you played a game 11 points closer than what odds makers expected, what the number expected. So you see a lot of rise out of lower conference type teams, Conference USA, MAC, Sunbelt, like I just rattled off before, simply because there's so many unknowns. There's 130 teams, and those conferences have teams that nobody knows anything about. For the most part, those of us who study all 130 have an edge when it comes to every college football Saturday. But that's why you see drastic jumps on lesser teams. I'll give you the ones that have been downgraded the most as long as we're at this. And it's interesting that the two teams at the bottom of the pile have been downgraded by 9.5 points and by 8 points, both associated with Matt Rule, who was here in Temple. Baylor, second to last, they've been moved downward 8 points. Temple, the most negatively moved power rating team right now, down 9.5 points. BYU, Oregon State are in the top 5, as well as East Carolina. So those 5 teams, their performances this year have been abysmal, and they certainly have been downgraded in the power ratings. Now it's, the next quarter of the season, and the question becomes, will odds makers move their numbers too much where they become what we would call ugly underdogs or teams that people want to stay away from and you can cash tickets with? We'll see. We'll see how far the odds makers do downgrade these teams. But in my numbers, those are the 5 that have been pushed downward the most.
Well, Rob, we talked a lot about what we saw last week. We talked about where teams are trending as we head into week 4 of the season. Let's talk about some of the games that we're actually going to get in week 4. Let's start out west with a battle of a couple of undefeated teams, Washington and Colorado. Colorado getting double digits at home against Washington. Any chance of them pulling off the upset and moving to 4-0?
Well, certainly they'll remember the beating that they took last year in the Pac-12 championship, that's for sure. Their defense has been really good. I thought when they lost defensive coordinator Jim Leavitt that potentially the defense might suffer, but Mike McIntyre made a great hire in DJ Elliott, and they've been real good on the defensive side of the football. So Colorado, from that aspect, really good. They still have playmakers on offense. Should be an interesting game, Rob. Washington has not really been tested yet. They're still a very good football team and the odds-on favorite to win the Pac-12. So I think we'll see a competitive game, and I wouldn't put the motivational part for Colorado as far as last year's loss in that Pac-12 championship. I wouldn't take that and dismiss it too quickly. They had last week against Northern Colorado, which was basically a walkthrough. They won it in nondescript fashion, 41-21. But you know that their last 2 opponents, Texas State and Northern Colorado, were probably or they probably had a heavy part of the practice week in preparation for this Washington game. So they'll be ready. They've had two very, very easy opponents coming in where they could devote some time to the Washington Huskies, and I think that Coach McIntyre will have that team ready to go.
I tend to agree. I like home underdogs just as a general rule, unless there's some big injury or they're just like a god-awful team statistically and have terrible matchups. I tend to like a home dog, especially when you're giving me that many points, leaning towards Colorado at this point myself. I don't think they've regressed, especially defensively, as much as people thought they would. I mean, you look at the one game that they had to play this year against a quality opponent in Colorado State, and they shut the doors on them. So I think that Washington will be able to get some points on them, but maybe not enough to pull away and make it a ugly blowout loss at the very least. Let's jump ahead to the SEC in a game you touched on ever so briefly during our review from last week, and the question is Mississippi State ready to take it to the next level and get up for another SEC game? Like you said, it is a gauntlet of a schedule. They've got to play the likes of LSU and Georgia and Alabama, and they have to do it week in and week out, and you can't take a week off. Does Mississippi State have what it takes to go onto the road between the hedges and pull an upset? If the early money is any indication, people seem to be giving Mississippi State a chance here, and maybe there won't be that letdown that you might typically expect in a spot like this.
Yeah, I think the early movement, Rob, is probably due to the fact that people just think it was a bad line to come out to begin with. Maybe it was too much to give 6.5 with Georgia. I know in the power ratings that I have, I had made that game pick 'em with Georgia at home. And when I saw 6.5, I thought, wow, that's kind of out of line. And since then it has come back a little bit. I don't know that it'll go back much further. There still are going to be the theories on that contest that will be backed by money that believe, Mississippi State can't put two of those together. We'll find out. They certainly showed us last week that when everything is rolling in the right direction, they're a physical football team that can hang in the SEC with the toughest of the tough. So I tend to believe that Georgia right now is not been very impressive. I don't know how you feel about them, but, if you're Mississippi State and you're walking into Georgia, you take the approach defensively that we're going to keep Nick Chubb and Sony Michel quiet and try and let Georgia beat us through the air, which I don't know that they necessarily can. And I do think that Mississippi State is capable with their front seven of keeping the Georgia ground game bottled up. So then it'll be on Georgia to try and handle Nick Fitzgerald and Harris Williams and that offense. I think Mississippi State's got a real shot here. I really do. You hate to kind of be, living in the moment rather than looking at the big, broad picture. But I don't think a play on Mississippi State is just living in the moment and off of the last thing we saw. I think that this team really is that good. And if they can stay injury-free, which is about impossible in any type of football nowadays, or at least limit their injuries, they can, be a contender in that SEC West for sure at season's end.
I think that it will be a good game. I really wish I would have gotten 6.5 very early in the week. I think that you're right, the line's coming back down to more of where it should have been to begin with. But I'm with you. I think that Mississippi State is a very live dog, and that Georgia should most certainly be on upset alert this weekend. They're going to need to bring the A game. They are going to have to make a few plays at quarterback, and they're going to have to stop the Mississippi State run game. I mean, between Williams and their quarterback, Fitzgerald, they're going to have some opportunities to make some plays offensively and get their points. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, Kirby Smart's a really good defensive mind, but so was Dave Aranda. And Kirby Smart sees what just happened to LSU's defense. So they're going to, come with the right game plan, I'm sure. But the question is does even the right game plan slow down Nick Fitzgerald right now? It's not that often, Rob. So many of these quarterbacks across the land are listed as dual threat, but they turn out to be one or the other. Either they're a good runner with not much passing accuracy, or they're a better passer without, the mobility. This kid's a legitimate dual-threat quarterback. He'll hurt you either way. And right now, Mississippi State, they brought a lot of kids back this year, and they seem to be a real cohesive unit. I would put it past them to walk in there and win the game straight up.
Well, let's jump to another game between two ranked opponents, and that is between TCU and Oklahoma State. Game kicks off at 3:30 in the East on Saturday, and rumor has that Oklahoma State already has 2 touchdowns on the board, and they're up 14-0 before kickoff. That offense scores quick. They do not waste any time. What can TCU do to try and slow it down enough so that they can keep the score manageable? I mean, you get up into the 40, 50-point range, you're not going to win that kind of a football game. TCU's going to have to control the ball. They're going to have to limit Oklahoma State's opportunities between Washington and Rudolph. And I just don't think they can do it. I think that Oklahoma State is probably the best team right there with Oklahoma in the Big 12.
Yeah, I don't think there's a doubt about that. I think the biggest thing with Oklahoma State, Rob, is that there's just too many weapons, and you don't know who to stop. Mason Rudolph will throw to any of those 5 guys that are out there catching passes. Justice Hill runs the football as good as anybody in the nation right now. Of course, he's got holes to run through, and he's got defenses that are gun-shy, that are playing 4 different wideouts, and so he gets gaps to run through, but still, he's a terrific runner. When you have the core that they have, if it's not, James Washington gets all the headlines, but it could be Marcel Aitman, it could be Stoner, as we saw last week, it could be Lacey, it could be Ty Johnson, the LSU transfer, it could be anybody. I think if you're going to beat Oklahoma State, the key to the whole thing is you have to get pressure on Mason Rudolph. And I know the ball comes out quick and the offense is designed. There's a portion of that playbook that can really negate a blitz or sending extra pressure into the backfield. However, it's the only way that you're going to slow them down is to get to Mason Rudolph before he can make the right read or before he can get the ball away. The problem for TCU is this. They've played one team with spread offense capability, pass-happy style team. That's SMU. They played SMU last week. SMU quarterback Ben Hicks dropped back 38 times last week. He wasn't sacked once. You get 0 sacks against SMU. You're not going to get too many sacks against Oklahoma State. So I find that to be a real problem for TCU in this game. They've got to find a way to create pressure. Couldn't do it against SMU. The week before that, they played a play-action style team, more of a pro-style team in Arkansas, a little bit easier to get to their quarterback. In the first game of the year, they played Jackson State. So the one true test they had against a 4 wide-out type team that throws the ball all over the lot, they just didn't get any pressure. SMU wound up scoring 36 points last week. SMU gained 463 yards, 339 through the air on just 18 completions. So they got big plays as well. It's a problem. It's a real problem. I don't know that Kenny Hill, the quarterback for TCU, can keep up in this contest. So I'm with you. The line on Oklahoma State has increased. I think they opened 10. I saw as high as 13. Middle of the afternoon today, I saw some 12.5s come back. I don't know that that's enough, Rob. When you set up 14-0, I think 14 is a good number here. Oklahoma State probably wins by at least that in this game. They're just impossible to stop because they have too many weapons.
Well, I'm with you. I don't think that TCU can keep up, and I don't think they can stop them. And to me, that just spells a recipe for disaster when you're trying to go on the road to a tough place to play to begin with and win a football game. I don't see it happening. I think Oklahoma State will easily move past TCU in the Big 12. Here's one game where a team might not so easily win. It's a road game for Michigan. They're going to Purdue. Purdue has looked good. They scored 35 against Missouri, which really isn't that many. Missouri's defense isn't that good to begin with. But what struck me is Missouri does have an offense, and they held Missouri to 3 points in that game. And now Purdue's going to get a chance to play at home with a big atmosphere behind them against a Michigan team. They've won, but they haven't impressed me this year. I don't know how you feel about Michigan, but I can tell you they're just not doing it for me right now. They don't look that great, and now they're laying 10 on the road to Purdue.
Yeah, and inevitably, if you don't, especially if you're a big favorite, Rob, if you don't live up to those expectations on a series of Saturdays, then the public perception is going to go straight downhill for you. Michigan's a 23-point favorite last week against Air Force. They win by 16. People find that dull. They're a big favorite of, what were they there, 20-some-odd points against Cincinnati. They pull away to win by 22. Again, 36-14. It's not the 63-14 that we're seeing out of Oklahoma State, so it's not as impressive. They're winning games by double digits. They won all 3 by double digits. They beat Florida by 16 to start the season. But when you're not running up those huge point numbers and you're not covering the point spread in a big way like some of these other teams across the nation are, then you're going to get some negative press. And mostly the negative press comes immediately if you're not doing good on offense. The national media, the average bettor, they all want to see offense, and if your offense is stagnant, you stink. This is a fantastic defensive team, Michigan. What they've done this year, holding teams to 2.3 yards per carry and only 208 yards a game. Air Force can run the ball on anybody with that triple option that they run, and they only get 168 yards rushing last week. So I think one side of the ball is absolutely elite. The other side of the ball hasn't caught up to it yet. Michigan's suffering public perception-wise so far. But I'll say this, Jeff Brom, the head coach for Purdue, is a real, a lot of coaches, Rob, when you watch them in press conferences, you sort of have to decipher what they're saying because they speak in so many cliches that you can't really tell what they mean. Brom's a pretty honest and direct guy, and he said this week in a press conference on Monday that he would love to bring his Western Kentucky style to Purdue and throw the ball for 500 yards. But he said they just don't have that type of ability on this team. They've got to be able to run. And then if they're up against it with a good run defense, they have to find a way to trick teams and get chunk plays. That's what they're running into here this week because they won't run it an inch against Michigan. And they're going to have to find a way with David Blau, who's been an interception machine the last year and a half. You're going to have to find a way to get some big chunk plays. The story's real nice, and Purdue's a way better team, but I think it might be the perfect storm here on Saturday. People are down on Michigan, high on Purdue. What usually happens when those types of contests come to fruition, usually the better team winds up winning. I think 10 might be a little cheaper than we would have seen if Michigan had been on, hitting on all cylinders right now. So I kind of like the Michigan side. I think defensively they'll handle business. But, boy, you can't credit Jeff Brom 3 games in with a team that came in last place last year. Well, maybe Illinois came in last place in that division, second to last place, maybe the second to worst team in the Big Ten. All of a sudden he's got them with real big expectations. And this Saturday's game is, extreme. It has the Big Ten network out there covering the game at West Lafayette with their crew. So that goes to show you how popular Purdue has become in less than a month.
Well, speaking of teams that are kind of exceeding expectations early in the year here, Vanderbilt off to a great start. Get a huge win at home against Kansas State Saturday night. Not the prettiest of games, not the most exciting of games, but, you know, they got a win 14-7, and now they get to host Alabama. Probably not going to win this football game, but it'll be a real good test to see where they're at. Do they lose 42-10, or do they lose 27-13? And I think this is a real good test for Vanderbilt to see what they really have, and if they can play tough and hang with Alabama for a half or even into the third quarter and lose a competitive football game, I think that can go a long way towards setting the tone for the rest of the season and proving that this early start wasn't just some kind of fluke.
Yeah, like you say, it's going to be a difficult challenge. We've seen over and over again this week the highlight of the Vandy defensive player calling out Alabama. You know, as has been said this week a lot, Rob, you have to be careful what you ask for and what you go out and attack, because you don't want to wake Alabama up. Listen, Vanderbilt, again, much like Purdue, it's a nice story. It's a good defense. But their best player on this football team the last 3 years has been their running back, Ralph Webb. The offense has been built around Ralph Webb, and he's coming into his senior season, and the expectations were huge for this running back, who's now played 3 games, carried the ball 58 times for 149 yards, averaging 2.6 per carry. 2.6 as opposed to the 5.1 he averaged last year. They can't run the ball. And they're not going to depend on Kyle Shermer to go out and score points against Alabama's defense. I wonder, much like with Purdue, Purdue's got a better chance to score a couple of points than Vanderbilt does, in my estimation, because I think Alabama's just going to cave in the offensive line for Vandy. And what they'll have to do is they'll have to hope that defense can hold up for 4 quarters against, again, you know, we kind of perceive Alabama as being a vanilla type of offense, but the weaponry on that offense is insane. When they really want to cut it loose, they cut it loose. When they really want to pull back the reins, they pull back the reins. They're about an 18.5-point favorite on the road here for good reason. They're easily 3 touchdowns better than Vanderbilt. Again, it's developed into a great story, and it reminds me of those Mike Tyson fights in the 80s, where Mike Tyson's going to fight a guy, they announce a fight, and you know from the moment they announce it that Mike Tyson's going to destroy that boxer. But the fight doesn't happen for 6 months. And in that 6 months, you watch enough and listen to enough and read enough to where you think, hey, maybe this underdog has a chance. And, you know, 2.5 minutes later, that underdog's out cold. So I just think that's kind of a comparison to what's going to happen here. I think Jalen Hurts and company should roll in that game because they'll take it serious. In years past, maybe they wouldn't have taken Vandy serious. They'll take them serious this time.
I tend to agree. I don't think there's any way Vanderbilt pulls an upset. Maybe a cover. I mean, 18 is, you know, that's a lot of points, but it's not too many for Alabama. I think the key will be if Vanderbilt can get 10 to 14 points, and maybe you go 31-14 and you squeak in with a cover. I think it's a fair number. I think had Vanderbilt lost last week, this number probably would have been 20. But with Vanderbilt pulling the upset last week, I think it's maybe a tad lower than it would have been otherwise. One more big game Saturday night. Penn State goes to Iowa. Iowa just keeps winning. There's no expectation for them with at least Vegas, it would seem. I mean, their win total for the season was 6.5. They're 3-0. Close call against Iowa State, but that's always a rivalry game. They got that win on the road. Now they get a chance to really stake a claim on this season, and they get to play Penn State. They're getting double digits in the game. They've been in this situation before as recently as last year when they were playing Michigan at home and nobody gave them a shot, and they pulled the upset and really put the Big Ten into chaos in terms of how is Ohio State going to the playoff, but Penn State won the conference, and that really comes down to the fact that Iowa beat Michigan, and then Ohio State beat Michigan, and when it came to the tiebreakers, it was Penn State that took care of business and ended up going to the playoffs.
Yeah, this is one of those where you almost mechanically go to the window and play Iowa because we've seen this movie enough where Iowa hosts a team on a Saturday night in Kinnick Stadium where Iowa's the underdog, and somehow, some way, they scrape out with a 16-13 win or something of that style. Wouldn't be surprising. Penn State's untested. Their defense has been very impressive, but I don't know if we can get that carried away yet because they played Akron, Georgia State, two of the most miserable offenses in FBS football, and Pitt, who we saw simply destroyed last week by Oklahoma State. Penn State didn't beat Pittsburgh nearly as bad as Oklahoma State did. In fact, Pittsburgh outgained Penn State in that contest by 30 yards. So I think while they're good and while there's a lot of hype around Barkley and Trace McSorley and company, if you're Iowa, Rob, we know what's going to happen. Kirk Ferentz is going to load the box. They'll probably be able to contain Barkley. Maybe he'll break one or two. But for the most part, they'll be able to keep him bottled up and try and put it on McSorley's shoulders. The other side of the coin, Iowa's offense, I watched it last week against North Texas, and they struggled massively against a Sun Belt defense, which doesn't bode well for Iowa. But Akram Wadley and James Butler, the transfer from Nevada, is a real good running back duo. With that offensive line, will probably test Penn State much more than they've been tested this year. And then the new quarterback, Nate Stanley, throws a real nice deep ball. Now, they're still Iowa, and they overshoot open wide receivers sometimes. But if he connects, like they just seem to happen to do in games of this nature, they're going to make this real tough on Penn State. I think that Iowa, while they're certainly not the better team, 12.5 points at home at night, you said it before, home underdogs in that price range, when they have a little bit of talent like Iowa does, especially on the defensive side of the ball, you have to look that direction. Like I say, the wins are nice that Penn State's put together so far, and the defense has looked much improved. But we want to see it against a real opponent, and they'll see a real opponent on Saturday. Not so much offensively speaking, but certainly defensively speaking.
Well, Rob, we've talked about all of the games that we ran through in the pre-show discussions. Give me one, whether under the radar or good quality game that you're expecting that people aren't talking about or we haven't talked about. You can go wherever you want to go with this one.
Well, I think something that's probably under the radar, Rob, because of other big games this week, but it has a big, big significance toward both head coaches would be Arkansas off the bye week at Texas A&M. Kevin Sumlin got off the hook last week because his team came up with a big second half, but they were losing at halftime to Louisiana Lafayette, and the boos were ringing out in College Station. Came out, they had a big second half, won that football game, and for the time being, some of that stuff is forgotten. But now they're going to, like I say, they're going to play Brett Bielema's team off of a bye week after being pounded by TCU, so Arkansas will come prepared. I think it's a real good football game. It would be a good football game anyway because the two teams on paper are kind of evenly matched. But Texas A&M has some severe injuries. Last week they started 2 backup freshman cornerbacks. We don't know. The health of their secondary looks to be a shambles again. We'll see if Arkansas is able to take advantage of that. And Kellen Mond at quarterback now for this team since Nick Starkel got hurt a couple of weeks ago. He's just not that good of a thrower consistently. So it's A&M's at home, and that always helps. But to me, that's a real good under-the-radar game, one to keep an eye on because you're going to get big efforts out of both sides. I tend to lean towards Arkansas plus the points in that one because of the A&M injury situation. But that offensive talent doesn't seem to be the same on Arkansas this year as it was last year.
I've got two, and if we have time, we'll get to them both. But we'll start with Florida, Kentucky. Kentucky is 3-0, and this would be a huge statement for Kentucky if they could beat Florida at home on Saturday night. It's an SEC network game Saturday night. We know the story with Florida. Still a lot of suspension issues. Still don't look like a very good football team. They've only scored touchdowns in one of their 8 quarters that they've played this entire season. Well, remember, all their touchdowns against Michigan were defensive. Even one of their touchdowns here against Tennessee was a defensive touchdown. The offense, 1 touchdown drive all year, and then the Hail Mary, so technically you can call that a touchdown drive. So 2 offensive touchdowns all year. Now they have to go to Kentucky. Off of that win against Tennessee, this could smell letdown and really throw Florida's season into a lot of chaos. Do you think Kentucky's got a chance? They're only getting a point and a half at home.
They certainly have a chance, I think, Rob, from the standpoint that Florida still just isn't a good offense, right? And Kentucky's gotten better on the defensive side of the ball. Hey, listen, talent-wise, they're still outmanned by Florida, but I think the job Mark Stoops has done bringing this particular group along and raising their level of play, and they do have playmakers on offense, whether it be Steven Johnson at quarterback, whether it be Benny Snell at running back. They've got guys that can make plays. And in a game like that with Florida, it may only take 2 plays. You know, we may be looking at 14-10, and a big run makes it 17-14, and they win. So I'm with you. I think they have a chance, no doubt about it.
The other one that I wanted to talk about, and it would be a big basketball game, is Duke and UNC. I mean, Duke off to a 3-0 start on the season. UNC has struggled, some disappointing losses, 1-2 on the season, but it's a clean slate in the ACC. So real quick, we've got about 30 seconds left before we got to wrap this up. What do you think of that one? I mean, is Duke going to get the win and keep their undefeated season going, or is NC going to kind of play spoiler there and kind of deflate that Duke balloon a little bit?
Yeah, I think Duke's the better team, Rob, plain and simple. The quarterback play is better. Daniel Jones, sophomore kid they call Daniel the Truth Jones. The offense extremely diverse. Give Coach Cutcliffe a lot of credit for bringing that defense around. It's been good through 3 games. Played Northwestern and Baylor the last 2 weeks and held those 2 teams to 37 points. So I just think that they're the more rounded team at this point in time. North Carolina's still searching for some defensive help. I discount the game against Old Dominion last week, who played without their top running back. So I think Duke can win that one by 10, 14 points. So I would look that way. They're a team to play on this year, no doubt about it.
Well, Rob, we've said it all. Let's remind our listeners, RobVenoSports.com, RobVenoSports.com, all of Rob's power rankings, statistical information, injury updates, great resource. If you're thinking about making a play, you want to confirm something, check out what we think, go ahead, RobVenoSports.com. If you want our plays for the weekend, we've got plays for myself, Rob Veno, Derek Davis. It's all there at RobVenoSports.com. Rob, you got anything else for us?
No, I just want to wish all the listeners a good weekend here with the games, and we'll be back next week.
Absolutely. We will be back next week. We'll wrap up what we saw in Week 4. We'll look ahead to Week 5 of the college football season. For Rob Veno, I'm Rob O'Connor. May all your wagers be winning ones this weekend. We'll see you next week.